Was this something you were destined to do? Where I am, by the way, destined to do as part of your legal career when you ended up graduating
No.
Yeah.
I fell into it completely by accident. Do you want me to tell you the story?
Sure, absolutely, love to.
I was a solicitor in private practice. I graduated, did what's called the Law Society Solicitor's Final Examination, and then I went into practice in the town, the biggest town near where I grew up, in Worthing on the south coast of England. Practiced commercial law in a growing firm for nearly 4 years, and then really decided it wasn't for me. Having wanted to join the Navy after leaving school, and not being able to do the job I wanted to do because of eyesight, I decided I'd go into the Army as a legal officer, as a judge advocate, which is what I did in 1991. Went to the Military Academy Sandhurst, did the Professionally Qualified Officers course, then went to the infantry in Belize as an infantry platoon commander for a year, where I commanded a platoon on the line between Guatemala and Belize when there was the dispute between the two countries before the peace settlement. And that was a very interesting experience for me, you know, commanding 30 guys, looking after their interests. After a year, I actually decided that I wanted to stay in the infantry, but the legal services said, no, you can come back to us and do a legal job. I went to Bielefeld in Germany, where our Army Defence Office was. I defended for about 7 months, and then got transferred to what was then headquarters British Army of the Rhine, which doesn't exist anymore. It vanished in the mid-90s, you know, with the end of the Cold War, where I was a legal advisor within the British Army headquarters in Germany, and also double-hatted as the military prosecutor for the Army garrison in Rheindahlen and in Dusseldorf. So I basically prosecuted many of the cases, because like the United States, we have full criminal jurisdiction over our soldiers overseas, and then Germany was our biggest overseas garrison. So, you know, soldiers commit assaults. Unfortunately, they often, you know, commit sexual assault, sometimes rape, sometimes even murder. I was actually quite fortunate in that job because my boss, who was a lieutenant colonel, left the army and they couldn't replace him. So I got, as a young captain, some quite intense experience doing some very serious cases. And, you know, I was only 27, which was actually very good and set me in good stead later. So I did that for 2 years, and then I got sent back to the UK to what's called the depot of the Adjutant General's Corps, of which the Army Legal Services is a part, which is basically the sort of home depot for the military police, the Royal Army Education Corps, lawyers, and then basically the staff support element of the British Army. Located in a beautiful place near Winchester on the south coast, magnificent place to be. But I had a pretty uninteresting job there, and I basically had decided at that point to leave the army. And the army said, well, no, don't leave. There's this court that's just opened in The Hague, the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, and they need people on secondment. And, you know, we'd like to send you for 6 months. So I was sent on secondment. My position was essentially paid for by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So I was attached to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and then sent to the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, where I ended up working on cases in central Bosnia, involving...
At the time, who was the prosecutor then? Was that Goldstone?
It was Goldstone. I mean, he doesn't remember me very well because I was very junior then. And I ended up working on this case, and, you know, on a very big team. Then I got put on a smaller case, which was the first case that I sort of took through myself to a full indictment, which was the Ivica Rajic case, which was involving the Bosnian Croat army, the HVO, and the Bosnian Muslim army, and it essentially involved the murder of 40 civilians in a village in northeastern Bosnia in 1993. Ivica Rajic was the commander who fortuitously for the prosecution, had actually been present on the ground commanding troops at the time of these killings. So it was a very strong case, very good evidence. The UN was on the ground very quickly after it happened, with British elements of UN forces who were well set up to, engage a photographer from the Royal Navy who'd had forensic training and could take proper photographs. So the evidence was very, very strong. Then, to sort of cut a long story short, even though in those early days it was very difficult to get any accused brought in for trial, United States pressure on the Republic of Croatia, which was linked to sort of ongoing funding, ongoing overseas aid, and just, the US is very good at that kind of arm-twisting exercise, forced Tudjman, the then president of Croatia, to give up Tihomir Blaškić, who'd been the commander of HVO forces where this absolutely terrible massacre had taken place in the village of Armici, also in 1993. And an American prosecutor was brought in to prosecute that case, who Richard Goldstone knows very well, a chap called Mark Harmon, who sort of became my mentor, who's former Department of Justice. He brought in another chap called Greg Keogh, also Department of Justice, now a partner in Greenberg Traurig, and in fact who I've been working again with recently, but doing defence work. And then they needed a third chair, basically, and they'd seen me do the preliminary hearings in Raic. Raic hadn't been arrested, but the rules of the ISTY gave provision for there to be sort of provisional hearings without the accused present, and I did one of those hearings, and Keogh had seen me, was pleased with the results, and so I was brought in as the third man, and that was the kind of thing that basically changed my whole career, because we ended up in this 2-year trial against a very large US law firm that had been employed by the Croatian government to defend Blaškić. It was a hell of a trial. I mean, it was an ordeal. And we were successful, and Blaškić was convicted at the end of that case for grave breaches of Geneva Conventions, crimes against humanity and war crimes, and got 41 years. Sorry.
No, sorry.
Yeah. That was that trial. Mark Harmon did such a good job on that case that during the trial, Louise Arbour had come in as the prosecutor, and the Srebrenica case, the first trial for events in Srebrenica, was about to kick off, which was Colonel General Krstić, and Harmon, God bless him, I mean, he went straight from the Blaškić trial, ended in June 1999, straight into Srebrenica, one back-to-back trials, I mean. And he asked me if I wanted to go with him, and I kind of hummed and hawed, because, we just had a baby, first baby, Alex, was born. Andrea, my wife, was pregnant with our second child, and it had been tough those 2 years, and so we talked about it, and then it was decided, okay, I'll do Krstić with him. And that was I've given a lot of interviews about that case. I mean, that was a case that sort of changed all of us immensely. I mean, it was, the worst criminal episode of the entire war, murder of upwards of 10,000 people in the space of 2 weeks. Very, very good case, extremely sort of powerful, strong evidence, almost as if God was watching when that crime was committed, because we had so much sort of supportive, corroborative evidence of all of it. Krstić, again, was convicted, first case, genocide conviction at the ICTY, first conviction for genocide post-World War II cases. He was sentenced to 43, or 44 years, one more year than Blaškić got. That was subsequently reduced to 25 years on appeal, because on appeal they found that whilst he was responsible for genocide, they basically reduced the mode of responsibility to aiding and abetting genocide, which, another story that we can talk about, but I mean, I find that an extraordinary conviction, that somebody can be convicted of aiding and abetting genocide. It's rather like saying, I opened the refrigerator, I didn't notice there was an elephant in there. When you're the commander of I just find it very hard as a commander of the military forces that committed the offence, and certainly with all the evidence that we presented, that he was found guilty of aiding and abetting genocide. That said, I mean, reduction in sentence, if his responsibility was not, what the trial chamber found it to be, reduce the sentence, but don't sort of produce some ridiculous, artificial creation. I mean, the guy wasn't, you know, the lookout for an armed robbery or something like that. You know, he was in there in the thick. Anyway, that was the next case. Then I worked for a very brief period of time on the Talic and Berginin case, which were for crimes in northern Bosnia, and I was brought in to be responsible for General Momir Talic, who subsequently became the commander of the Bosnian Serb army, and in fact whom NATO forces did a lot of liaison with, but during the war he was commander of the Krajina Corps, you know, who committed some absolutely appalling crimes against the Muslim and Croat community in northern Bosnia. He died during the trial. He contracted cancer and he died. I mean, basically he was said, I think it was September of the year 2001, he'd been diagnosed and given 6 months to live, and the presiding judge essentially let him return to Serbia to die, and indeed he was dead actually within 3 months. After that, I was then appointed by Carlo Del Ponte as senior prosecuting counsel in the court, and I became responsible for the case against General Ratko Mladic, all of the cases against the Kosovo Liberation Army, which were very tough because, you know, there were countries that were not very keen on those prosecutions, including my own, because the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, was kind of seen as the darling of the international community in Kosovo. You know, even though they committed some quite terrible crimes themselves. I mean, you know, the Serbs had committed absolutely appalling crimes in Kosovo, but the KLA had too. But they were being sort of, well, they were charming the international community, and the international community had been seduced by them. I was dealing with all of the cases in Macedonia, and then all of the residual cases that flowed from the Talic case in northern Bosnia. I then led the first prosecution of members of the Kosovo Liberation Army, which is a very interesting period of my life because, you know, not only was it a very unpopular prosecution with the international community, it was very unpopular with the KLA. And in essence, by that stage, the KLA had become a sort of legitimised form of government in Kosovo. Many former members of the KLA were seen as heroes, you know, and rightly so. You know, they did look after their own people, but there was a lot of organised criminality that had become associated with governance in Kosovo. You know, it's still a problem to this day. And it became sort of increasingly insecure for all of us who were involved in the case. Many of the witnesses in the case were intimidated into essentially retracting their evidence. The individual who I had eventually persuaded to come forward and basically lead the community of witnesses into the trial was blown up in his car and lost a leg, and so we had to then move him to another place, and you know he's living in another part of the world now. Very, very, very difficult case to do, and of course, you know, the defence.
It must have been tough emotionally for you.
Yeah, it was terrible. It was a terrible time. I mean, Srebrenica had been very tough emotionally for different reasons because of the scale of the criminality. Kosovo is very difficult because we were all placed in a very precarious position. I mean, my wife's an American, and at that time, you know, we had 2 children, and in fact, I sent her back to Haverford in Pennsylvania during the very bad time when, you know, they sort of discovered threats against a number of us. I don't know how real it was, but, you know, they're not nice people. You know, they're not the kind of people that you go out for Sunday lunch with, that's for sure. So, you know, it became a difficult period. Anyway, we got to the end of that trial and we managed to convict one of them. The other 2 were acquitted mainly because the evidence that we were going to lead against them, it never came about. Right. And indeed, in the second prosecution of members of the KLA, which was the Ramush Haradinaj case, where in fact Ramush Haradinaj was acquitted, the appeals chamber has just ordered a retrial in that case because of witness intimidation. I don't know how successful it will be. Again, I mean, you can't, if people vanish in Kosovo, you know, you can't find them. You know, if they're intimidated to such an extent that they basically disappear, you've had it. After that case, I went to the International Criminal Court, where I worked mostly on the first case involving events in Darfur, and I led the investigation which led to the arrest warrants against Ali Khashib, who was an Arab militia leader, and Ahmed Haroun, who was the Deputy Minister of the Interior responsible for events in Darfur. You know, he was basically the sort of operational commander and coordinator of police and military operations within Darfur. I mean, that was a very interesting experience because as you know, that was a referral by the Security Council to the court. The Sudanese argued all along that the court had no jurisdiction in Sudan because Sudan was not a signatory to the Rome Statute establishing the court. They didn't recognise any obligation they had via the Security Council. They just didn't accept the legality of that. Prior to the arrest warrants, there was a sort of early stage of cooperation. I don't know whether you really call it cooperation, but certainly communication between the Sudanese and the court. We went on 3 visits to Khartoum. A lot of it was essentially sort of giving us propaganda positions on what was going on as opposed to the reality. Although we had one quite interesting encounter where I had been... How public is this? That what we're doing?
It's for the Jackson Center.
Okay, so yeah.
Sure, it's not going to go.
Okay, all right, yeah, okay.
I throw it in the archive.
No, that's
20 years from now.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah,
okay.
It's just, I mean, this became a bit sensitive, but in essence, we persuaded the Sudanese to allow me to speak to the corps commander, the Army Corps commander, who had been commanding the Sudanese Army Corps that was responsible for most of the fighting in the areas that we were interested in. He's a very interesting man, actually. He spoke fluent English. He wanted to speak to the prosecution. He'd spent time with the U.S. Army at Fort Hood in Texas, is that? Yeah, he spent time with the Americans. He had much admiration for the US and British Army. When he found out I was a former British Army officer, he sort of had a sense of trust. He had known Peter de la Billière, who was the British Army commander in the First Gulf War, who, interestingly, between 1977 and 1980, had been the head of the British military advisory team in Khartoum. So there were a lot of links, and I knew de la Billière. So there were all kinds, you know, like everything in life, there were all kinds of links that led to this interview. Anyway, I did this interview, this chap, and we interviewed him as a suspect. And there were 2 legal officers, Sudanese army lawyers in the room, who were clearly intelligence officers, military. They weren't lawyers, but who were there to sort of protect the government's interest. And he made some very interesting admissions. In particular about an Arab militia leader that we were interested in, who'd been allegedly involved in a number of atrocities. And we knew from the evidence that we had that this Arab militia leader had been connected to his army corps. And I don't know if you recall how it worked, but essentially what the Sudanese did, you know, as actually, to be frank, happens in many counterinsurgency operations around the world. The British did it too, and it ended in disaster. That what the Sudanese army did, they didn't have sufficient forces of their own in uniform to deal with the rebels in Darfur. I mean, I know there's a lot of misrepresentation in the US actually about this war. I mean, in my own view, and I mean, I know there are, you know, we should talk about it here. This is a counterinsurgency operation that went horribly wrong. You know, where they basically ended up, you know, murdering civilians, burning villages down in an attempt to stop a rebellion. I mean, it doesn't make the crimes any less serious, but you have to see it in the context in which it is. You know, it was mounted as a military operation to stop this rebellion. The Sudanese army couldn't deal with it. They didn't have the resources, nor the training, nor the loyalty to deal with it. So what the government very stupidly did was to engage Arab tribes in the region who had had their own disputes with the African tribes in the region, and it's actually quite hard to even distinguish between Arabs and Africans in that area because they're all so kind of interrelated, intermarried. But if to put it simplistically, it's Arabs on one side and Africans on the other have been fighting over resources in the region ever since the British left in the 50s. The Arab tribes, in particular the Fur and the Masalit, believing that they had been not properly treated by the government in Khartoum. And I mean, the British, Sudan as a country, it doesn't really exist. I mean, the British sort of cobbled this, there's about 40 different tribes in the country. The northern part is Arab dominated, and the southern part, where they're seeking independence. The southern part is essentially African dominated, and Darfur is kind of a mixture of the two. So the government in Khartoum brought these Arab militia in to fight a proxy war on their behalf. And of course, inevitably what happened is it went horribly wrong. And of course, the government knew about the fact it had gone horribly wrong, but continued nevertheless to pursue this conflict. Arab tribes, basically the army would sort of surround an area, the Arab tribes would go in, seeking the rebel forces, and what they essentially did was burn villages down, murder women and children. These kinds of counterinsurgency campaigns have done before. The British did it in Malaya. I mean, I don't think they deliberately set out to kill women and children in Malaya, but it's this argument of in order to kill the fish, you basically remove the water. So if you get rid of the villages that provide food, manpower, weapons, if you destroy that, then you basically destroy the base of the rebellion. But of course, in the process, it's led to catastrophe in Darfur. In any event, this Sudanese general, we knew of a particularly notorious Arab militia leader, and it was interesting. He, under pressure, after about sort of 5 hours of questioning, he acknowledged to me that he'd had this guy called into his office on numerous occasions because of problems of controlling what was going on in the region. I said, "Well, General, what do you mean by controlling what was going on in the region?" He said, "You know very well what I'm talking." I said, "What, you're talking about killing innocent people?" He said, "Absolutely killing innocent people." And at that point, these two guys, "All right, stop the interview. And they stopped the interview. They went outside. There was a big sort of kerfuffle and a chat, and then we recommenced. And I'd been instructed, you don't ask any more questions on this area. And so I said, look. So we start the interview up, and then I said, "General, the only thing I want to know is what you've just told me. Was that actually reported to headquarters in Khartoum and then on to the military committee of the cabinet?" He said, "Absolutely it was, and that was it. They pulled the plug. They pulled the plug on everything. took the tapes. that was it. But I mean, at least we knew. At least we knew that it had.
Good for you for asking.
Yeah. Then in May, I did the first case. I did the first arrest warrants before the court. They were issued. That was in February of 2007, and then May of 2007, I left the court after doing 2 years, and I went to private practice in London. In fact, where the first letter that you sent me in Bedford Row. Did some domestic work for a short period of time, and then got instructed by Charles Taylor in his defence, which was an interesting place to be put. But as you know, in the UK, we largely prosecute and defend, and we also have this cab rank rule where you accept the cases. You're like a taxi. If somebody gets in your taxi, you drive off. I was co-counsel on that case with a guy called Courtney Griffiths, who's still instructed in the case. I did most of all the pre-trial work, because what had happened in that case in 2007 is that it went to trial in June, and the defence lawyer announced that a guy called Karim Khan, who was also a former prosecutor from ICTY, he essentially announced that he wasn't ready to go to trial because they had insufficient resources, and he basically withdrew from the case. So they were in a bit of a panic because, of course, this is a very important case. And so I was immediately approached because people knew I'd left the ICC and gone to the bar in London. I was immediately approached, but I felt that, even though having led a number of prosecutions, I wasn't ready to lead a defence of a guy like this. It needed somebody with more defence experience, which is why Courtney Griffiths, who's a Queen's Counsel from London, first British Jamaican Queen's Counsel, very, very good lawyer, was instructed. There was an adjournment of the trial until the following January because we needed to obviously get ready because nobody had been involved, and the judges agreed to a sort of 7 or 8 month adjournment until the following year. I did all of the pre-trial work because Griffiths had got a very busy London practice with another guy called Maurice Anya, who's a Nigerian lawyer who'd also worked at ICTY. During the same year, I was instructed by Ivan Chermak, who was the second accused on the Gotovina case, Operation Storm. And again, because I was working on Taylor at the same time, I decided that I'd get a London Queen's Counsel in to lead on the defence, a guy called Stephen Kay. With Taylor, it was decided in about where are we now? During 2009, it was decided that I would actually withdraw from the case, mainly actually because of financial issues, because the court, as you know, the Special Court for Sierra Leone has had sort of funding crisis after funding crisis, and I was being well paid on a private case, which the Chermak case was, and essentially they needed more resources to sort of get more junior lawyers in. So I basically withdrew from the case and then worked full-time on the Chermak case until May of this year, and that was linked to my appointment in Cambodia. In essence, in 2009, in September, Robert Petit resigned during the Doik trial, and so they urgently needed to find somebody to replace him quite quickly. I was actually on holiday in Maine with my family because, as I explained, my wife's from just outside Philadelphia, and I got a phone call from UN headquarters in New York saying, "Look, would you like to go to Cambodia?" I said, "Well, look, I'm in the middle of a trial at the ICTY at the moment. I mean, it's going to be tough for me to sort of, do both. I mean, I can't." And they said, "Well, come and talk to us." So I went to UN headquarters in New York. And I remember, I was supposed to be going for an interview, and I was basically wearing a polo shirt like you're wearing at the moment. So I sort of turned up to UN headquarters in New York, had an interview. There were a number of other candidates, interestingly. There were. I mean, I found out subsequently. And then a week later, they told me that my name was basically being put forward to the Secretary-General, who had to nominate 2 candidates to the Cambodian government. So I was nominated along with a guy called Nicholas Kumjian, who, interestingly, is the current prosecutor in the Taylor trial. And he and I had worked together as prosecutors at the Yugoslav war crimes tribunal, and then he went to the Special Court for Sierra, and so we'd been sort of battling it out on the Taylor case, and then suddenly we found ourselves both being put forward. That's how life is, isn't it, as one gets older. And I was put forward, and I actually think, to be frank, I mean, Nicholas Kumjian is an excellent prosecutor, very, very able chap, and I think probably I was the more favoured candidate by the Cambodians simply because I wasn't an American. I think they would have had a problem with an American prosecutor, particularly the generation of Cambodians that are sitting on these committees because of the war and the history and how they feel. Although now, to be frank, the US is a huge player in Cambodia, but I think at least of that generation that was sitting on this committee, so they appointed me. Nick is the reserve, so if anything happens to me, he sort of comes in. I'd agreed with the UN to finish the trial in The Hague first, so I didn't actually go until March, although for various reasons the trial actually went on. The Gotovina case, because the prosecution reopened their case, but it had already been agreed that I would go in any event to Cambodia in March, which I did. And so I've now been in Cambodia for nearly six coming on for 6-7 months. Took over at a sort of a time of sort of gloom and despondency within the court, which has now changed into a much more positive spirit, not because of me, but because of events, really. We had the first verdict in the Doik case, which sort of buoyed things up. We've just filed our final submission in the first case, which is in essence our pre-trial brief. And and we're waiting for the charges to be issued soon by the investigating judge. It's a civil law system as opposed to common. So it's a judicial investigation, and the judges lay the charges. So very, it's a good case. The second case, and this involves the 4 most senior remaining leaders of the Khmer Rouge regime. And we anticipate that trial will begin in probably March or April of next year, and will be anything up to 2 years in length. What we're battling is the age of the accused. They're all elderly people. But it's, you do realise in a country like Cambodia, however much the court is criticised and whether it's really worthwhile going through this process, this is an entirely traumatised society. You do not meet anybody that's not in some way affected by what happened during those 3.5 years. Even people that were unborn at the time have stories to tell because their parents, young adults, people in their 20s, their parents were sort of, in their 30s and 40s, at the time of these events. So it's keenly felt in every family. Just to give you an example, when I went to book my ticket to come here, young woman running her own travel agency, and, it's a small sort of, living in Phnom Penh in Cambodia is really like living in a village. So, I'm in the paper almost every other day, so people recognise me. And she says, "Oh, you're the man from the choir." I said, "Yes." And then she proceeded to tell me how her mother had survived the 3-year period of Khmer Rouge rule as a young, actually as a teenager, but that because she'd remained with her father, because what the Khmer Rouge often did is they separated families and sort of sent them to different parts of the country. They essentially atomised society. That was their aim, so that people would sort of worship the state and not be influenced by family, religion, all of the elements that in a free society we take for granted until you go to a place like this. And she'd been with her father. And with her younger brother, they survived. The mother, so her grandmother basically perished because that they went to another place where they were all that side of the family was worked to death. So you literally, wherever you go in society, in that society, there nobody's unaffected, and you see it in daily life. There's a lack of compassion in society. There's a lack of sort of sense of tenderness or feelings of warmth between people. You really sense it. And actually, if you talk to Cambodians about it, and I'm quite close to a man called Yuk Chang, who runs the Documentation Centre of Cambodia, which is this organisation that was funded by Yale to sort of gather up all the documents. He absolutely confirms this and says it's true. Yeah, absolutely. That's what happened in this society. So they have a lot to answer for, these 4 individuals who are confronting trial. I think that they don't regret much, actually, from what I've read of those that have given interviews. None of them have been interviewed by the judges, but they've obviously been interviewed by the media and by people writing books about what happened. So it's going to be a tough trial, there's no doubt, for a whole host of reasons. I'm fortunate in my job because, unlike the other prosecutors, the expectation is that I will actually lead in court, which is good because that's what I enjoy doing most. There will be an appeal in Doik, which I'm also going to be leading on. We're appealing against sentence and then some other technical points about the way that certain crimes were subsumed into others. But the appeal on sentence was really a reaction by the public outcry to that victims' groups were not at all happy about that.
What was the
35 years.
35 years. How old is he?
67.
Okay.
Well, it was reduced ultimately actually to 19, but that was because of time already served, and also he got a discount because of the period of illegal detention. All of these facts are actually, there's a greater purpose to the Cambodian court, and I realise how important it is. And I think there are lessons to be learnt for the International Criminal Court. We are also building capacity in this country. There's no doubt about it. I was sceptical about it when I first went, but I'm absolutely convinced. The Khmer Rouge essentially destroyed the entire legal profession within Cambodia. They killed all the judges, all of the lawyers. I mean, they killed all educated people, actually, but within that group were lawyers and judges. So when the Vietnamese invaded in '79, and, you know, society was, you know, recreated there, they basically started from scratch, and then they had a period of civil war for almost 10 years. So really they've not had kind of stable development of legal profession and judiciary since the early 1990s. So they don't have experienced judges or prosecutors. There's also, unfortunately, corruption within the system. So doing things properly, doing things fairly, applying the rule of law, respecting fair trial rights, and actually that's why my defence work has been exceptionally useful for me to rely on, because then I can actually pass on to my national colleagues, because, you know, the court is built on the basis, you know, there's an international element, but we have national colleagues who are equal to us, and in some respects, you know, stronger than us, because it's a domestic court. So I co-sign everything with my national colleague, Chia Liang, you know, who expresses very strong opinions about matters. So it's not that we're there simply saying, no, do this, do that. You know, I have to go through very, very lengthy processes of negotiation with her, you know, and she with me, in order to settle what we're doing on a daily basis, which is good because we learn from each other, but more than anything, I hope I can at least pass on this belief that the process has to have integrity. If it doesn't have integrity, it's worthless at the end of things. You know, I love that. Probably I'll misquote it now, but I mean, obviously coming to this place, and, you know, Jackson, you know, what he said in his opening statement, you know, to pass a poisoned chalice to their lips is to pass it to our own as well, you know. And when I was there in Cambodia, I thought, Jackson, how right you were, because you see it in this court. If we don't do this properly, the legacy of this place will be absolutely worthless, because it will basically be regarded as a political fix. You know, it was done. All of these people were just convicted. None of their rights were respected. It leads to problems. Don't get me wrong. We've got one at the moment in the Doik trial, because he's sacked his international lawyer and he now has two nationals, and I'm not sure that they really know what they're doing. And, you know, people have been surprised in the court that I, as the prosecutor, have said, look, guys, I mean, we can't, you know, we can't just sort of slam dunk this, you know, on appeal. He's got to be properly represented. Otherwise, it's worthless what we're going through. But this, you know, this leads to problems. It's not easy.
From your education early on, what did the Nuremberg trial, what was taught in London of the Nuremberg trial? You know,
what did I learn about it?
Yeah, exactly. Were you going through their formal education aspect?
I think.
Was it taught much?
Yeah. Was the Nuremberg trials taught much? To be honest with you, answer no. But I went to a very traditional, old-fashioned school where, you know, English history was only really sort of taught up until the end of the glorious years. You know, up until the Edwardian period. You know, beyond that, very little modern English history was actually taught. I think mainly because it wasn't a period of particular pride, and I went to a school that had historically educated administrators of the empire, you know, people that went on to... So I don't think people were very much interested in that period of history, even though, you know, there were many, you know, glorious moments for the British during that period, although, you know, I suppose the gradual decline of British power was seen. And I think Nuremberg, even though the British were heavily involved, it was seen as a US-inspired process. Later, from my own interest, actually, I did read, because I was very much interested in the Second World War. And actually, the first book I read, which is a book that I was subsequently... I mean, I read this book, I lost it, and then when I went to The Hague, somebody just coincidentally gave me the same book, which is a book called Nuremberg by a man called Adrienne Fulford. Have you read it? Yeah, I mean, it's actually a very good book. I mean, it's a very easy read on it. You know, and Adrienne Fulford, I mean, was a man who I remembered, you know, very distinctly as a, you know, how old was I when he was killed? I I was 15. He was killed in 19... Actually, maybe I was younger than that. It must have been because the Conservative government was in power. I think he must have been killed in like maybe I was much younger than that. Maybe I was about 9 or 10. He was the Conservative Party spokesman on Northern Ireland affairs, and the IRA stuck a bomb under his Jaguar in the House of Commons car park. I think now, my memory serves me, in 1973, 1974, and he was killed. And you know, he was a war hero from the Second World War. He'd served in the infantry. Interestingly, I mean, the thing I love about that book, which you'll remember, is the beginning of the book, because he goes to stay with a German family in the 1930s. You know, he's from a very privileged family in the UK, public school boy, and he goes to Germany, and he ends up marching down Unter den Linden with this boy who's, you know, a member of the Hitler Youth, and he's there, you know, as a 16-year-old, you know, marching, and they're all, you know, they used to carry these sort of torches, and they're all marching, and Hitler gives a speech to these kids, and I mean, Hitler's quite far away, doesn't, you know, and Ari and Eve can't see him, but they can hear him, and he said, you know, even as a 16-year-old, I sensed that there was something very wrong with what was going on in Germany. And then, of course, he goes back to the UK, then the war starts, he enlists in the infantry, fights through the war, and then at the end of the war, because he's a trained barrister, he's sent to Nuremberg, where, I mean, you probably know much more about this than me. He's the one that's, because he speaks German, he's basically sent to serve, he serves the indictments on the accused. And so when I, you know, that really was my knowledge of the work of the court. But then because of that, because of reading that book, and in particular reading the small extracts about Jackson, you know, I became more interested. And I mean, and I was actually saying to Megan last night, you know, if I ever need a moment of inspiration, you know, read Jackson's opening at Nuremberg, because it really is an inspiring piece of prose. I mean, you know, let alone an opening statement for a prosecutor. I mean, it's a remarkable, remarkable speech he made. You know, both opening and closing, but I love the opening, actually. I think the opening is absolutely magnificent. Yeah.
I asked everybody, here you are going to be the next couple of days at Chautauqua Institution, place you've heretofore not been. And what do you hope to accomplish? Is there a...
what do I hope to accomplish? I mean, I suppose one of the strengths of these kinds of gatherings is you get to speak to colleagues from other courts. I mean, I think that's exceptionally important. And I think in the US, more than other places, you actually see the benefits of that kind of gathering. I mean, it's good to sort of share knowledge and information with each other about, you know, what we're doing, because oftentimes we lose touch with the details of what colleagues are doing in other places. We might know broadly what's going on, but we don't know the details. I think that's very important. I'd like to learn more, you know, about where Jackson grew up. You know, Megan was telling me, she comes from Jamestown. I mean, Jackson grew up here. I mean, he really is, you know, when you know, it's a remote place in the US now, you know, it's off the beaten track. I mean, then, you know, and the fact that this heroic figure emerged, you know, is a wonderful American story, you know. I mean, it really is, you know, and it's why I always tell my children, who are both Americans and Brits, you know, if you can make it, you know, go to the US if you really want to make something of your life, because you won't be subject to the same kind of limitations and constraints that exist in the UK. So I'd like to learn more about Jackson and what sort of shaped him, and also share experiences, you know, with colleagues here.
You're terrific. I really have been extremely informed. I'm a transactional lawyer. I'm not a criminal lawyer. And so when we created the Jackson Center 10 years ago to expand the legacy of Justice Jackson, you know, there's various parts of his life. Supreme Court justice, the personal issue. How did a guy who lived on a farm, small farm,
absolutely,
in Spring Creek, who never went to college,
right. He read for the bar with a lawyer, which is actually, that process existed in England until 1982.
That's right. Well, it kind of, in some places, it still interests, but without that formal education, somehow work its way up to such high level, and to be the chief American prosecutor at Nuremberg. How amazing is that?
But look at, I mean, the United States. That's why the United States should never feel too down about the way things are, because I think you have this spark in this country, which honestly it's very real. When you live here for a long time, you kind of, I'm not saying you've lost it, but I think you just get used to it being there. But it's there. Every time I come back, there's a spark about this country. I'll give you another example of somebody very similar to Jackson, Abraham Lincoln. Almost identical, no formal education, born actually probably into a much poorer family than Jackson was, read for the bar with a lawyer, became very successful lawyer, you know, on the circuit. Then went to the House of Representatives. And then, you know, I mean, you know the rest of the story much better than me. But you know, very similar guy. And again, a guy who, you know, anything you read by Lincoln is absolutely beautiful. The way he expressed himself, completely self-taught. You know, lived in a log cabin in Kentucky, I think. Am I right? Yeah, right.
Yeah, you're great.
Yeah. No, it interests me because my children, you know, are Americans too, you know, and obviously being married to an American, you know, it interests me a lot.
I'll make sure that tonight we're at the Jackson Center. I'll give you a couple of books for your children. And it's on Jackson's life, written for young readers.
Oh, excellent.
It's just one of those great, lot of pictures and stuff, so I'll make sure you get
Have you read Team of Rivals yet? Which is, this is I've actually got it with me, and I forget who the author is, but it's about Lincoln's cabinet, and about how he brought together this group of people who had been his sort of political competitors, or people that were very critical of him, and who absolutely loved him, you know, when at the end of his second term, of course, you know, he was murdered, but how he converted this group of people who were his political competitors into this unbelievably loyal group of comrades. I mean, fantastic book, yeah.
One of those guys just lived right over the hill from here.
Yeah. William Seward. I was telling Megan, I said Seward was in the cabinet. He was the Secretary of War? Or Secretary of State, yeah. So Seward is also from Jamestown.
Well, Westfield, which is in the same county.
Okay. No, I went through Westfield. Okay, so Seward was born in upstate New York too. Yeah.
Great things here. We're delighted. We look forward to this. Thank you for your time.
No, my pleasure.
And what's the question I should have asked you that I didn't?
Yeah, the question that people often ask me is, how on earth could you do defence work when you'd prosecuted for so long? And it's interesting because a lot of people told me at the time that you're, you know, because of the let me put this carefully, because of the moral platform on which many of these prosecutions take place, they said it will be very, very difficult for you to ever get back to prosecution work. And I actually disagreed. I said, I actually think doing defence work will be the making of my career, because I think one of the difficulties of prosecution work in the modern era of international criminal law is that there aren't enough prosecutors with defence experience. And whilst, you know, there's a great sort of moral force behind these prosecutions and a need to convict individuals, we also have to ensure that trials are fair. Because if we don't do that, the system won't survive, or it will be so, people become so cynical about the whole process. You know, if everybody's convicted, that there will be no strength to it. And actually one person I really admire, I mean, I'll come back to the question that you put, is Adrienne Fulford, who's the High Court judge presiding in the Lubanga case. Now, he is a former defence lawyer. He's never done any prosecution work at all. And in fact, the ICC is very fortunate to have him presiding in the first case, because what he's doing is he's building all of the fair trial guarantees into the trial process in a very, very strong and constructive way, so that future cases that are heard there will actually enjoy the fruits of that legacy that he will leave behind, even though there's been immense criticism of that case and the fact that it stopped and started and stopped and started. And I think there are things that need to be examined in that case that haven't been done particularly well. But nevertheless, that side of things is a very positive thing. Going back to the question that you asked me, so I think doing defence work has actually made me a much better prosecutor, and I think it enables me to confront issues within prosecutions before they even arise, because I know what the defence are going to be doing, which, you know, I did to an extent before, but actually being on the other side, you know where people are going to take things and what the game is. So that's been an immensely useful experience for 2 years, and I think has made me grow as a lawyer very much so, and has also, I think, made me more objectively examine my own decision-making process. And I think there is a tendency in this line of work for sort of self-congratulation, and I think one has to be very careful about that, because after all, you know, these are criminal trials like any other, and a prosecutor is an officer of the court like any other prosecutor in any small domestic court. You have the same obligations, the same duties. You need to make sure that things are done properly, and you need to make sure that's done in advance of a trial, so that you don't suffer the consequences of things not being done properly in terms of preparation, you know, being exposed in trial, which is not a good place to be at all.
Yeah. Great.
Okay.
I've taken up a lot of your time.
No, it's interesting. I've talked about myself a lot.